Greetings, 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 everyone. Happy Sunday. And we are so happy that you decided to spend your hour with us on this evening where your time may or may not have jumped forward an hour. So if it has, you probably, like me, have been scrambling all day to try to figure out how to stay on top of things. So we're really happy that you decided to spend this hour with us, the All African People's Revolutionary Party. Thank you for coming. And our topic today, the Radical Act of Breastfeeding in Capitalism. And as always, we want to extend hope that you are experiencing your highest level of mental, spiritual, and physical health. Obviously, that's critically important. And we are just glad that you're here with us. We, of course, honor the indigenous people of the Western Hemisphere. Always, we start with that because they are the caretakers who have shielded us for over 520 years. When we escaped the slave plantations, there was only one place that we could go, and that was where they were, where we were effectively protected. So we acknowledge and appreciate their sacrifices on our behalf, and the fact that this is still their land in 2021, and they should get their land back. And we, of course, honor our African ancestors. We are not confused about the relentless struggle that our people have engaged in for those 528 years of colonialization, neo-colonialism, capitalist development, and institutional oppression. So we are thankful for our ancestors who are the very reason that we are here with you today. And so with that, we'll go ahead and get started. The Radical Act of Breastfeeding in Capitalism. And most of the presentation today is going to be carried out by Shakura, but we both agreed, and we hope that you do as well, that breastfeeding is a human issue. It's not just a women and women identifying issue. So although my intention was to expect her to carry out the entire presentation, she insisted that I participate in some of the presentation here, which I certainly agree with her logic. So we are going to go ahead and get started. First, of course, we always have our introductions. We are a longtime organizer with the All African People's Revolutionary Party, the APRP, on 3 continents and the Caribbean. And with me today is Shakura, who has grown up in the All African People's Revolutionary Party's Young Pioneer Institute program, and she is finishing up her doctorate degree in communication public health with a focus on women, particularly African women. And she is an activist as well around those issues, of which I've had the honor and privilege to participate in the activist work that she is engaged in where she lives around those issues. So just honored to be here with her and to share in her immense knowledge and on the ground work, specifically around the question of breastfeeding, because I know that's a specific focus that she has. And I've seen the passion, I've seen the multitudes of women, working poor women, that her activism and the comrades that she works with have helped to facilitate. So just honored to be participating with her today in regards to this critical issue. And then again, going back, the objectives of the APRP are Pan-Africanism, which we define as one unified socialist Africa. And I'm sure you can hear my birds in the background because they're Pan-Africanists and they're scientific socialists and they're anti-patriarchal. So whenever these topics are heard in this house, they always have to give their input and feedback about how we need to be fighting for a better world. So if you want to understand what we mean by Pan-Africanism or one unified socialist Africa, you look at the Handbook of Revolutionary Warfare there by Kwame Nkrumah on the right, and the strategy to achieve Pan-Africanism that he lays out in that outstanding book is the unification of all Pan-African entities on the ground throughout the African continent. And so you see some of the logos of some of those organizations, not all of them, who accept that definition of one unified socialist Africa and are working to engage on the ground and to facilitate that work as one collective unit around Africa and around the world. And we have chapters worldwide as well as relationships with other liberation movements. So we are just glad to have you here with us. And we will start out, and I will actually start out before I turn it over to Shakura. And just to make the initial point, you all, and just want to thank you all, whether you're on Facebook or YouTube or Zoom watching and participating, thank you. And when Shakura is speaking, we'll try to look at the comments. Tried to do it last week because she did the majority of the presenting, but they didn't show until after the event was over. So I think I've fixed that problem, so we'll see. So we'll really try our best to do that. But I want to start by saying that the system of capitalism is a system, again, as we have said many times, that is based on exploitation. The system of capitalism was built off of seed money provided by the transatlantic slave trade, or the enslavement of our African ancestors. And that money from that horrific period in history was used to finance industrialization. And so there you have it. The dominant system in the world today was built on that exploitation. But patriarchy, which because of the emerging dominance of capitalism, has become an appendage of capitalism, as before capitalism, it was an appendage of feudalism, which was the previous dominant economic system before some 100 years ago. So patriarchy is different because patriarchy existed before colonialism. It existed before colonialism came to the Western Hemisphere. It existed before colonialism came to Africa. So one of the points I make in the book I just published, A Guide for Defense Against White Supremacist, Patriarchal, and Fascist Violence, I'm talking about the need to build anti-patriarchy consciousness in communities and neighborhoods. And one of the points that I make in there is that because patriarchy, unlike capitalism, has been around for thousands of years, a lot of people confuse patriarchy with historical cultural developments and practices. People think patriarchal things are just a part of people's culture. And I know you all can think of many examples in your head when I say that. But because of that, it's created this normalization of the commodifying of women and women identifying people's bodies, and making women and women identifying people's bodies the property of the state. And the property of the state means property of men-dominated institutions. And so because of that, the attitudes of control and dominance have come to define everything about women and women identifying people's bodies. And so this has extended to the natural act of breastfeeding, where the natural act of breastfeeding has been exploited into being a question of a woman or woman identifying person exposing a part of their body that men view as a sexual organ. And so because of that, there's been this anti-woman identifying people's bodies component that's developed. And so now we see ourselves looking at breastfeeding in many instances, and many women and women identifying people will certainly tell their stories about this, how they have to struggle to be able to breastfeed because there's this stigma in the society, this backward society, against doing it. So this is the reason why this issue cannot be looked at as just a women's issue or a women's identifying issue. This is the issue of exploitative culture that is a manifestation of this backward system. And so that means it's everybody's responsibility to do something to change that and create a better consciousness, which creates a better system. And so men are not outside of that. So as a man, and as men, and any men listening right now, you have to recognize that breastfeeding is your issue. It's your responsibility to cultivate an environment of security and respect for this age-old process. And I can say that it's not just rhetoric, because when Shakura was a baby, of course, this was in 1987. So you didn't have the level of maternal time off work maternity leave that you have today. And you certainly didn't have paternity leave. What I had to do is I had an old capitalist job then, and I scheduled time off in anticipation of Shakura being born. It was approved with the understanding that obviously I wouldn't know when I needed to use it, but whenever that time came, I would be able to use it. And then when her mom went into labor and I told them I had to go, they acted like I was being irresponsible on the job, and then called me 4 or 5 times at the hospital while Shakura's mom was in labor, harassing me about coming to work, and never did give me any time off. But that's okay, because when I left that job, a whole lot of stuff from that place left with me, and I'll just leave it at that. That's 30 years ago. I'm sure the limitations have expired by now. But anyway, that made, that created a scenario because her mom only had 6 weeks off work, and she worked evenings and weekends, and I worked Monday through Friday. So I had to learn the supportive methods necessary to make sure that Shakura was breastfed. That meant assisting her mom in being able to pump the milk, making sure the milk had an environment where it could last and be fresh and healthy, and making sure I had a schedule that I could adhere to, and making sure that even when I had her and her mom was not around, she was able to benefit from breastfed milk. So, I understood it from that component of participating in it. And I encourage all you men that have the opportunity to do that, because it's very essential that you play a role in that process. There's so many components to it that we don't have time to get into today, but it's very essential. And because our work is anti-patriarchal, then we as men should see ourselves as accomplices to this effort to stop this criminalization of women and women identifying people's bodies, and to respect this age-old practice, which is a very essential feature for health and safety in this society. So we as men, or even if you're a women or women identifying people and you don't have children or don't plan on having them, or you've already had them and you're not going to be intending on breastfeeding anyone ever again, all of us still need to see this as all of our responsibility, because this question is a question of forward progress, and it's a question of freedom, liberation, and respect for women and women identifying people's bodies, and it's a blow against patriarchy. So with that, I will turn it over to Shakura.
That was outstanding, Daddy. Thank you. I hesitate to continue speaking because I feel like we could just end the presentation right there. But I humbly have a few more things to add. So I thank you so much for starting us off. And as always, good evening, everyone, or good morning, depending on where you are joining us. Good day to you. I, of course, echo my dad again by saying we hope that you are hanging in there as much as you can be. And I just want to do a quick shout out and just say that we really, truly, truly, truly mean that. The party very much cares about people's well-being and collectively how we are doing. And so we don't just say that with an empty thought in terms of just saying like, I hope you're well, and then moving on to the next statement in terms of getting something from you. But we legit want to process and make sure you understand that we care about you all. And we know that you all care about us because you're joining us every Sunday. So we both know that the system needs to change. We both know that things need to go in a different direction so that oppressed people can actually have humanity, decency, socialism, and resources, because everyone deserves that when it comes to living in a world that is equitable and that does not have any type of oppression. So the only way to do that, as I've said before in previous weeks, is to try to protect our emotional, mental, physical, however all of those components look like, so that we can in fact do the work. If you are distracted, if you are not committed to the work, if you don't understand, or if you are in support of capitalism or patriarchy or sexism, or if you are Islamophobic, or if you are homophobic, then you're not ready to do this work. And so maybe you might want to take a step back and just kind of think about how the same systems you're supporting are actually doing the oppressing. And then once you kind of flesh that out a little bit and tease that out, then we welcome you to come back once you have a different approach, because we really need all hands on deck. And that actually brings me into my first bullet that I'm going to talk about tonight, is that for the most part, the most revolutionary thing you can do And whether you are man identifying or woman identifying, my dad said it perfect, was to understand that breastfeeding is a global health issue. And we collectively need to understand that, believe it or not, whether you yourself were breastfed, whether your cousin was breastfed, whether your mom had the ability to breastfeed, whatever the case may be, breastfeeding affects every single one of us. And I want you to think for a moment, just follow me for a moment. It's going to sound like I'm going way off tangent, but I'm actually not. I'm proving a very specific point by asking you to just think for a moment about sanitation workers. Just take a moment and just think about them. If you don't know what a sanitation worker is, maybe you were socialized to understand that those are garbage workers. They pick up the garbage in your neighborhoods, okay? So my dad has given the example before, growing up in the Bay Area, that there was a garbage strike back when he was a young child. And so I want you to think about what would happen if sanitation workers or garbage people just decided to go on strike and stop picking up trash for just 2 days. I just want you to think about that. Think about your neighborhood, how many people literally collect garbage, how many times you see people taking out garbage. Maybe you don't pay attention to things like that, but I personally take out the trash at least twice a week because I fill up my bag pretty quickly. I have a puppy. She's generating trash and tearing up stuff. So I have to clean up after her, pick it up, throw it away. I do recycle, so I'm taking that out too. But the point I'm making to you is I'm just one person and I generate 2 bags a week. Well, if there's 4 weeks in a month, that's 8 bags right there. And again, I'm one human being, you all, one human being that is contributing 8 bags of trash in 1 month's time. There's 12 months in a year. So just think about your family structure. And think about how if sanitation workers decided to stop picking up trash for just 48 hours, can you imagine how nasty the streets would be? Rats would be everywhere. My dad has literally said this. Mice would be everywhere. Raccoons, opossums, different animals that are smelling this trash and are gravitating towards it. So we have to understand that sanitation workers, whether we pick up trash ourselves, whether we work as a sanitation worker, whether our cousin Jojo is a sanitation worker, if you have no connection to sanitation workers, at the very minimum, they benefit you because they choose to do the job that you yourself are not willing to do. And I would argue that breastfeeding is the same exact specificity when it comes to understanding that breastfeeding impacts you, whether you yourself are capable of breastfeeding, whether you know someone who has breastfed, or whether you believe that breastfeeding is the answer. Regardless of your standpoint, I guarantee you, when people, women identifying, decide to breastfeed their children, they are supporting you. And I can give you some examples in just a moment. So I just want to start off by saying my dad is right. I'm very passionate. So you just got to get ready because for the next 40 minutes, you all have given me the opportunity to educate you if you're not familiar with these concepts, and maybe to kind of give you some more information and more resources if you already have a working knowledge of breastfeeding, but maybe you can sharpen that skill just a little bit more. Okay. So I want to start off by saying the most revolutionary thing you can do is breastfeed your child. And the reason I say that is because we already know that capitalism is literally a deconstructing system that literally has biological impacts on people's bodies. We know that. Like, I just want you to think yourself about how stressed you are if your boss calls you tomorrow and says, we don't need you anymore, you're fired. That happens to me every summer. I'm on an assistantship with my doctorate program and I am not funded through the summer. So for 4 months out the year, every year since I've been in this program, I have to literally figure out how I'm going to pay the bills from July 1 to September 30th. And then once the school semester starts, then I pick my stipend back up. So it's extremely stressful to think about how you can survive in capitalism, because if you do want to live comfortably and have a roof over your head, if you do want to have functioning electricity, if you want to have water, if you want to have resources to be able to put gasoline in your car or put food in your refrigerator, then you need to have income. That's just how this system works. We know that the system doesn't care about people. We know that this system could care less, actually, about people. And so because of that, you need money to do that. So the point I'm making to you is the most revolutionary thing you can do is choose to breastfeed your child or chest feed. I want to be very inclusive about that language. Maybe chest feeding is what you're doing. So that's the most revolutionary thing you can do, because capitalism is already set up to tear your child apart. And don't get me started on if your child is of African descent, or if your child is indigenous, or if your child is interested in identifying with LGBTQ. There are many, many, many tiers of how your child is going to have struggle and strife growing up. But by you choosing to give your child human milk, you're actually encompassing your child with a couple of things. And I'm going to break it down for you. In the next slide, we'll talk a little bit more about that. But I just want to start you off by thinking that you're giving your child these revolutionary tools of armor, if you will. So you're literally impacting their internal system by choosing to give them human milk. And you're also in affecting their external system, believe it or not. And I can give you some examples of that in just a second. So that's the most revolutionary thing you can do. There are many other things you can do. Of course, political education, and you can teach and help them grow and encourage them to join an organization working for justice and things of that nature. But from the moment that they come out of your body, however that happens, C-section, vaginal, whatever the case may be, the best thing you can do is choose to put them on your chest if you are woman identifying, or if you're man identifying and you have the ability to lactate, put them on your chest and just allow that process to take its toll. And I guarantee you the baby will know what to do, because there is a communication that has been happening for the last 9 months between you, the parent, and your child. And your child is already familiar with you, the parent, because the child knows what you smell like. Are y'all with me still? This is some deep stuff. The child knows what you smell like. The child knows what you sound like. The child knows that you are there to protect them, because the child knows that they just came from you. So as soon as you put the baby on your chest, you literally get to watch the magic happen, because the baby is already having a hard time functioning, because they know that they are not in their element anymore, but they also know that you are there because they feel your body. So you actually are regulating their body temperature, which is why I emphasize skin to skin contact as soon as possible, because you are allowing their body to literally regulate, because your body can help control their temperature so they don't get too hot and get upset about that. So you're regulating their body temperature with the skin to skin. And then because they're on your chest, they can smell your nipple, which means they know that the food is not far. And the first thing they want to do is get some nourishment now that they are in the world and they do not have that tube coming to them anymore that is connecting the food that you eat down to their mouth. So I would strongly encourage skin to skin and putting the baby on your chest immediately after birth, and just allow the magic to happen. This is your first time meeting your child. The best thing you can do is just allow that space to be calm and collected for your child to engage themselves with you, understand that, oh, you're that person I've been inside of for the last 9 months. It's nice to meet you. Okay, thank you for allowing me to be inside of you. I really appreciate that. Now, if you don't mind, I'm very interested in getting some nourishment, because I know you have that. You've been feeding me for the last 9 months. Why would today be any different? And then from there, that's where that bonding actually takes place. Okay. So before we talk more into that, of course, we have to talk about the historical landmarks that have contributed to why we as African people are not able to consider the benefits of breastfeeding in a way that we will not be socially stigmatized, in a way that we will get the support that we need, because there has been traumatic events that have happened and happened over and over again with us that has not allowed us to understand that we really do have the right to feed our children how we want to. And sometimes we don't have the support to do that. So that makes that kind of scary for us. And so I just want to be humble in admitting that I understand from a timeline standpoint how much of an impact that has been. Okay. So, of course, we all know what wet nursing is. But in case you don't know, I just want to continue to be explicit when I think and talk about the impact that slavery has had on our people. And what it means is, if an African woman identifying slave recently gave birth, then we know that she was able to lactate, because for those that are aware of that process, as soon as your baby comes out, again, whether it's C-section or vaginal, the body communicates. The uterus communicates with the mammary glands and with the lactiferous ducts in your breast cells and says, hey, there is no longer a child inside of the uterus. Now it's time to start making milk. Okay. So that communication process happens between your nervous system, your bloodstream, your oxygen, all of that. And that's why I say to put the baby on the chest as soon as the baby is born, because the very first thing you can do is give your baby colostrum. But our African women identifying slaves did not have the option to do that. So they gave birth. Their babies were literally stolen from them and sold off to go to other plantations, but yet their breasts were full of milk ready to give to their child that they literally couldn't give it to. And so the master would take this lactating woman, identifying slave, and have her feed whoever master's children needed to be fed and whomever else. And that's where the term wet nursing came from. So I personally would like to dig a lot more deeper into that, but I already have a dissertation topic, so I'm not going to study that too much. But I personally think that because of that, a lot of African women are traumatized by it, because they literally could not feed their own children. And I just want us to think about how much our ancestors had to go through to not have the ability to do that. That's really deep, y'all. And when we think about it now in 2021, I don't think it's just as simple as she's not willing to breastfeed. There's got to be more to that, and we need to be humble and actually talking to her or them about what that looks like, and what they know and what they're comfortable with. And as my dad pointed out, we need to also make sure to add in this idea of the sexualization of breasts, the sexualization of the body, and how does that also play into their trajectory of how they think about feeding their child. And then last but not least, the social acceptance about feeding a baby out of a bottle versus feeding a baby on your chest and on your breast. Why is that not socially accepted? There's so many implications with that. And we really need to think about that, a very, very deep lens. Because again, if you yourself are not in a woman identifying category, but you still see yourself as a chest feeding or breastfeeding supporter, then your job is to make sure that you find a way to support our colleagues, because we still need to make sure that all of our children, especially our indigenous and our African children, are getting human milk if at all possible, so that they can hopefully have the armor that I talked about to be in a healthier state later, so that they can deal with capitalism, because they are less likely to have some of the mortalities and morbidities that I'm going to talk about that would enable them to fight off these systems of oppression. All right. Okay, so formula was introduced in the late 1800s. And from there, it was actually targeted to families that were not African identifying. Okay, so we actually could not afford formula. And I remember my dad shared a story with me where he talked to my grandmother and asked her, "Moms, you breastfed us when we were growing up, right?" And my grandmother looked at him and said, "Of course. Like, what would my other option have been?" And I always just cherish that story, hearing her say that, because I know that formula companies were not targeting Africans because we were not significant. We were in what's the word? We're not significant. We were invaluable. We didn't have value to them. They wanted to target families that they knew they could profit off of. Again, capitalism is always at the root of every single thing. Never forget that. So they wanted families they could profit off of, which at that time was European families, because European families were affluent and they could afford to pay for formula. Then, as the United States government developed and became more heinous and more criminalized, they decided that they would offer formula through women, infant, and children. Or if you're familiar with the term WIC, then that's where that comes from. So what a lot of people don't know is, yes, WIC does provide formula to families that are quote unquote low income or have a low income and can't afford to go to CVS and buy formula because they have a certain amount of income that they make a year. So because they can't afford to go to CVS, then they go to the women, infant, and children clinic, and they can get as many cans as they need up to the child's certain amount of age in life. So I think it's up to 2 years of age, if I'm not mistaken. But the thing about WIC that a lot of people don't know is they actually have a strong breastfeeding supportive group in place. And so what I mean by a group is they actually have a tier where when you first register with WIC, they ask you, do you plan to breastfeed your baby? And if you say yes, then what they do is they pair you with a peer counselor, which is somebody that has had a child and experienced chest feeding or breastfeeding themselves, so that they can literally coach you through and walk you through the trials and tribulations that you experience when you are going through that process of nursing your child. And a lot of people don't know that. So I just want to continue to highlight that I personally have sat down with peer counselors who are not interested in the income. They legit just want to tell their stories to those that want to hear it, so that they can hopefully help other families give human milk to their babies. Because again, that is the most revolutionary thing. And if you really think about it, that's also a huge disparity. And it's one of the most encouraging oppressive things that can happen, is when a child deserves human milk and is not given the chance to get it. That's an accessibility and that's a systemic issue, and that needs to change immediately. So as we continue to think about WIC, I want us to also think about how they're pairing families with peer counselors and encouraging them. But over a period of time, women identifying people are not getting the support that they need for whatever reason. Maybe it's from their partner, maybe it's from a family member who has a negative taste of what human milk looks like in terms of their child having access to it. Somewhere in their family, someone is giving them a hard time. So they get to a point where they do not want to continue the process of nursing their child. Maybe they're not getting support at their job. As my dad stated, that's another capitalist issue, is All these companies talk about how they want to support their employees, but yet when they tell them I'm pregnant and I'm going on maternity leave, first of all, they don't have the adequate amount of time to take off when you literally have a baby. So whether that's vaginally or even C-section, you shouldn't be returning 6 weeks later, but that's clearly a capitalist issue. We're not even going to talk about that. So the person returns 6 weeks later, and then they're trying to produce milk in a very stressful environment. And if you know anything about milk producing mammary glands or lactiferous ducts, then you should know that there's no way you can produce milk when you are stressed, because that's literally the opposite of what happens when your body is producing milk. You need to be in a calm state, because nursing your child actually increases your dopamine in your brain, which makes you feel good. Are y'all with me right now? It literally makes you feel good. That's why women identifying people who nurse their children are less likely to experience postpartum depression after the baby comes, because they are nursing their babies and they feel good. Literally, the chemical in their brain makes them feel good by doing that. So if you are not able to nurse your child, then the opposite of that, the hormone that stresses you out, the cortisol level increases, and that makes it really hard for you. So you're not able to produce milk if you feel stressed. And you want to talk about being on a 15-minute break where you're trying to assemble your pump and do all these things. You're not even getting paid to do that. That's an inadequate situation. We're setting them up for failure, literally. And that's unacceptable. So we need to fix that. Okay, so I also want to talk about how we have to think about what this looks like in terms of benefits. So I talked a little bit about how there are less women identifying are less likely to experience postpartum depression. Women identifying people who nurse are also more likely to experience a reduction in developing ovarian, breast cancer. They're less likely to, they're more likely to lose weight faster. They are more likely to have a reduction in developing diabetes. Okay, that was a new study that just came out. And as I said before, nursing your child helps to increase your ability to have less stress. Okay, now, what are some of the benefits for babies that are given human milk? So babies that are given human milk are less likely to develop obesity. They're less likely to develop allergies. They are less likely to develop diabetes, just like their parents. And they have more of a chance of enhancing the bond that they feel with their parents, as well as the security when it comes to feeling nurtured and valued and close to your parent. Okay. Again, they know what you smell like. They know what you sound like. Those are all things that they're familiar with. And as you start to recognize what the cues are, the feeding cues that your baby will show you, that will allow you to get a more solidified action when it comes to nursing. And so, am I saying that it's challenging or not challenging? Each experience is different. I don't have children yet. I've just studied this to the point of no return, and I'm interested in becoming a lactation counselor. So I've studied what it takes to do that. But every story is different. All I can push to you is that organization is key. And that's why we need as many people on deck to help support women identifying parents who want to nurse their children. And I also think that it's important that we continue to think about, what have our ancestors done? And what is being done in the continent currently? Because we can't focus on what's being done in America, because this is not our home. We need to go back to our resources, go back to our houses in Africa, and understand that our ancestors have been doing this for ages. Okay, so just, if nothing else, go back to the roots. Always go back to the roots. And then last but not least, just thinking about how deadly capitalism can be in terms of reminding families that they are not adequate enough to do the nursing capabilities themselves. And I can give you an example of that in the next slide. So as we think about what it means to support one another, I want us to start to think about, what does community defense look like in terms of how we build areas that can literally protect the act of giving children chest feeding or breastfeeding human milk. Okay, so that might mean that we might need to camaraderie together, and we might need to be in solidarity, because maybe we all work with a woman identifying person who spoke to their supervisor about receiving support on the job, and the supervisor was not willing to comply. So then that means that the rest of the coworkers need to rally up together, and maybe that means do a strike. Maybe that means all not come to work one day. Maybe that means figure out a way for that person to get support, where you all create an avenue yourself in the workplace, so that they can have what they need to give their child their human milk. Because again, their choice to give their child human milk indirectly impacts you, whether you know it or not. And if you think about what that looks like, I'll just give you an example. For all the families that nurse their babies, they are less likely to use bottles, because for the most part, the baby is just feeding from them off of the chest or off of the breast. So if they're less likely to use bottles, then that means the bottle increase of litter and garbage impact is less, because less families are using bottles. So once families are not using bottles, they're less likely to throw bottles away. If they're less likely to throw bottles away, the bottles are not increasing at the compost near sanitation or garbage area, wherever the area in town is that all the bottles would go, as they continue to add to our garbage issue that we're trying to control. That's just one example of that. There's many, many, many out there. But when it comes to nursing your child, you are impacting other people, because your child has the ability to be healthier to some extent. I'm not saying that children who are nursed are not able to get diabetes. There have been some cases where that has happened, but they are less likely to get it. And women identifying who nurse their children are less likely to develop diabetes, as opposed to women identifying who don't nurse their children. So again, there are benefits with that, but we want to continue to think about that from a global standpoint, because we all need to make sure that people are not experiencing oppression. And if that means giving their child human milk, or if that means experiencing something patriarchal, if that means experiencing something racist, then we need to stand up with them. That's where the community defense comes from. So as we think about that, that also means we need to unlearn colonialism. Okay, so that means we need to take that out of our brain. And again, go back to the roots. Pick up a book, pick up Nkrumah's book, pick up some of our comrades who are women identifying, and see how they have talked about nursing their children. See what kind of things they have said. Sojourner Truth talks in very great detail about being on the road and giving speeches while nursing her infant with her. Okay. I also want to point out that we need to continue to think about how we as a African community have all these sicknesses that we're dealing with. So diabetes, hypertension, obesity, these different things. And as I talked to you in the previous slide, nursing children has the ability to reduce that. So as we think about what it means to not let the system deter us, those are some tools that we can use to help reduce our chances of detecting those diseases in the first place. Now, yes, we need to increase our physical activity. We need to try to very much be positive and enhance our mind by picking up books and reading them and having discussions, joining work studies, building up our political education. But that also means building up our ability to understand that we can start by doing the very first thing, which, as I said, is a revolutionary act within itself, of giving access to that human milk. And that also means doing some more research when it comes to understanding what that implication really looks like. So what do I mean by that? I mean that, I don't know if you all know, but in the first 2 days of life, a baby's stomach is the size of a cherry. So if you are choosing to nurse your baby, that means you need to do some research and understand that your child has the size of a cherry at 2 days of life. Why is that important? That's important because if you're choosing to nurse your baby, then you need to understand, on average, your child is going to eat between 10 to 12 times a day. So if you're nursing, you need to be understanding that you're going to be nursing about 12 times a day, because a cherry is not that big. So that means that you're not going to get frustrated with breastfeeding or chest feeding, because you already know your baby's stomach is the size of a cherry, and you already know you're going to be feeding them about 12 times a day, if that. What's the size when they're 4 days of life? The size is a walnut. So you understand what I'm saying? So we need to do some serious research so that we can understand the sacrifice that we are trying to make, because we see the end game of our children having more organization and more health behind them, so that they can do what we need them to do. Because at some point, we're going to have to pass the baton. At some point, we're going to be too old to do this work, and we're going to need them to help us do it. So that means giving them as much as we can, so that they can be equipped to do that. And that also means doing the research so that we can try to follow through with the goals that we set out and have some discipline behind that. Not just try it for 2 weeks and then say that it was too hard and give up. Am I shaming people that have done that? No, absolutely not. But I am asking you to do some information research before you decide to nurse your child, so that you do understand what you're getting into, so that you can be that much more committed to the act, because we need you to nurse your children. We need you to nurse your children. That is a disservice to all of us if that is not being done, because more of our babies are not doing so well. And some of our babies don't even make it past their first birthday because of infant mortality rates. So we really need to do better with supporting one another. Next slide, please. All right. So I talked a lot about why it's important to put the baby on the chest within the first day, the first hour of life. So I'm not going to go into any more detail of that. But I do just want to talk about some quick terms that you may or may not be familiar with. So when someone says that they are exclusively nursing, what they mean is that the only food the infant is given is human milk from their parent. That there's no water introduced into the baby's diet. There's no formula. There's no crackers. There's no applesauce. There's nothing else. Exclusive nursing means just human milk from the parent. That is all that means. And what I'm encouraging us to think about is, how do we do that in terms of setting our goals? Is it the first 6 months that we're doing that? That's incredible if you can do it for 6 months. Are you aiming for a year? That's even better if you can do it for a year. Some people do it for 2 or 3 or 5 years. Whatever your goal is, just be organized to set a goal for yourself, because we really need you to stick to it so that you yourself can have that time with your child. And then you also can set goals for other people. You can show other people and demonstrate it within your families. As I said before, because slavery has kind of knocked that out for a lot of African families, there are limited abilities for African families to literally see a woman identifying African woman in their family who's actually nursing. So this idea of it being demonstrated to them is very scarce and very low in a lot of families. And we have to change that. We have to change that narrative. I also want us to define that partial nursing would be the opposite of exclusive. So partial literally means you're doing nursing, human milk, but you also might be adding in some supplemented formula, or you might be adding in some water if they're past 6 months of life. You might be adding in something else over that period. So for those that are trying to understand what that means, it's important for you to understand what you're doing, especially when we know the system is corrupt, because when you go to have your 3 to 5 day appointment. So once your baby is 5 days old, ideally you should be taking your baby back to the pediatrician for their first checkup, if you have the capabilities and the access and the means to do that. So if you are in a position where you can do that, because the system is so backwards, many pediatricians don't even have a weight chart on their wall that is based on a baby that has been given human milk. Many of the weight charts that they have are based off of babies that have been fed formula, which, as you can imagine, would be completely inadequate if your baby is exclusively breastfed and you were taking your child to make sure that their weight that they have on the scale matches with the chart of however many days they are. So imagine how confused and defeated a lot of parents feel when they see their nursed breastfed baby or chest fed baby on the scale, and they're worried that their baby is not gaining weight fast enough, or maybe they're worried their baby is eating too much. And then they look at the chart to measure it out based on what it is, only to find out that it's not adequate. And I could talk to you all day about how the chart is inaccurate within itself, because it's more likely based on white supremacist standards. So obviously, if you're African, and that chart is not accompanying to you anyway, but that's another story for another day. What I will say is, that's where doing the research really helps. That's where you literally asking your provider, I just want you to know I'm going to exclusively breastfeed my baby. So I want to make sure that you understand that, as I know how much my baby should be gaining based on their weight. And if you're unsure about how to do that, try to find someone in your community, maybe an elder of some type that may have helped raise babies in the past, or maybe they may have nursed some children and they might know something. If you can't find it there, maybe you could take to social media, or maybe try to find an organization that might be able to give you some information. The previous slide, I had an organization that I volunteer with, B-Stars. We just had a community baby shower yesterday. So there are people in this world who have good intentions for you and that study this kind of stuff all the time, where they might be able to help you with that. And if nothing else, pick up a book and read it on your own, and then communicate what you've read to someone else and have a dialogue about that, so you all can bounce ideas off of each other. I just want to highlight this picture really, really quickly, because it's really important. This is based off of the Women, Infant, and Children Clinic that I told you about. And they just show you that when you are able to give your child human milk, the comparison to formula is irrefutable. There's no guarantee that formula will ever be able to match what a woman identifying body can do when it comes to generating human milk. So I just want us to continue to think about how, I've said before, it's revolutionary, but I'm literally trying to help you see, if you're women identifying, then you have amazing hormones, you have amazing antibodies, you have amazing nutrients, you have all of those things inside of you based on the choices that you choose when it comes to consumption of food. And a lot of people think, oh, I have to eat salads and kale every day to breastfeed. That's not true. There are plenty of nursing parents who eat McDonald's and Chick-fil-A. And if that's what you choose to do, that's what you choose to do. There's nothing wrong with that. So I just want to make sure we understand that if you choose to give your child human milk, just do you and do your research, and make sure you talk about your research with other people so that you can make sure that you're bouncing ideas off of one another. and building up that community defense, but also that political education that's involved with that. Just really quick, milk supply is just like gasoline in your car. So the more that you feed your baby, the more your body is going to be communicated that it needs to make more milk. So it's a supply and demand concept. So just like gas in your car, the more you drive, the less you'll be able to go far, because once you get to an empty tank, you're going to need to refill that back up. And then just keeping in mind that, another reason that people get discouraged about breastfeeding and chest feeding is because they have pain in terms of milk being backed up for whatever reason. So that's where we talk about engorgement or mastitis, things like that, that can be really, really hazardous and harmful to women identifying parents. So we want to make sure that if you're not able to nurse, then you pump. If you're not able to pump, then you hand express. But you need to release the milk out of your chest or out of your breast so that more milk can be built up. And then the milk that's being built up will actually have space to do that. It's literally like a balloon that is at its capacity and has no more space to add any more water. Once you add more water into this oversized balloon, it's going to pop. And so it's not the same thing as when you have a breast, but it can be darn near close, because it can be really painful for some women identifying parents. So just making sure that you release that breast milk and that human milk as you need to, so that you can have the ability to have healthy breasts and healthy chests, so that your child can have what they need and so that you don't have any health complications later. Next slide, please. Okay, so last but not least, as we said before, we'll say it again. Political education is key. Join an organization working for justice. There are numerous organizations that exist that can give you more resources and just have you have some reading material so that you can do some readings, have assigned readings, and then discuss those readings with other people. There are plenty of comrades, plenty of ancestors in this work that have had to raise their children while they have done this work. I mentioned Sojourner Truth as one example of that, but there are many others. So I want us to look to our ancestors in terms of what they've done, because they are going to lead us in the direction that we need to go in. If it all else fails, we need to go back to the roots and go back to how they set the parameter for us in the first place, because colonialism has helped eradicate this from our brains. And we need to go back to that so that we can remember how it was done before. That also means that we need to continue to have conversations about capitalism. So we talked about nursing being a global health issue. I also want us to think about how, yes, on an individual level, you are doing that. But as an individual, your choice to give your baby human milk impacts the entire world, whether you know it or not. And I gave the example about bottles increasing the garbage dumps. That's what they're called. I couldn't think of it before. The garbage dumps, because now less families are likely to throw bottles away, which means bottles are not impacting the garbage dumps that we have. So that's just one example of that. So just thinking about how people's ability to do stuff impacts you, whether you know it or not. And just thinking from a more socialist collective standpoint, that's going to be really helpful if we're really going to eradicate these isms that are causing these oppressions. And then last but not least, continue to just think about how this looks for you in terms of what you plan to do in terms of supporting someone who really needs these resources. As I said to you before, B-Stars offered a community baby shower yesterday, and we impacted 70 African families that did not have any means to get a car seat or any means to have a stroller. Some people got a pack and play because it was based off of a randomized raffle. What am I saying? I'm saying that that's one of the community organizations I belong to. And I am very proud to be a part of that, because I know that African people need help because they are not living in a just system. And they should not have to travel around with their infant without a car seat just because they couldn't afford to buy one. That's unacceptable to me, and a hazard to the infant's health, obviously. So as we continue to think about that, that might mean you doing some research for someone and passing the research along to them. Maybe you yourself don't want to be a part of that organization. As my dad has said, maybe you are tired of hearing me talk about chest feeding and you want to start a different organization where you don't have to hear me talk about that. But as many people as we can get to actually join organizations, that's going to mobilize this organized idea that we need so that we can have more people pushing and agitating the current systems that are in place. The current systems are in place because not enough people have been literally rocking the boat. And so the more of us that rock the boat, the more that these experiences and these situations themselves are going to change, because it's the answer is within us. We are the ones we've been waiting for. We're here. And for those of us that are ready, let's continue to do that work. As I said, if you're not ready, then don't come, because we don't need you to taint our system and get us off track and distract us. But if you are ready to do this work, then as my dad will talk about more in the next slide, then that means joining an organization or starting one yourself where you can actually start to have concrete ideas on how you're going to mobilize and do that. And it might be something as minor as talking to a family about chest feeding or breastfeeding, or it might be something as major as talking to a family about chest feeding or breastfeeding. Thank you so much for your time, you all.
Thank you very much, Shakura. And listening to you, I just wanted to go over some of the comments that are coming through. A lot of people are expressing real appreciation for your passion, for how you articulated the concepts and how much information that has been shared over the last 50 minutes or so. And our comrade Erica had a funny comment thanking you for saying eating junk food is okay. And so we definitely, I'm sure a lot of people will appreciate that. We have to have something to get through this system, that's for sure, to keep our sanity. But also, you know, listening to you, what occurred to me, a couple of things occurred to me to close us out for today. And one of those things was that, you know, people, for the last, all the years that you have been here on the earth, I have had this conversation so many times I can't count, but people just really don't have an understanding of just how difficult it is to really struggle in a principled way to try to live a revolutionary lifestyle in a backward, anti-human society like this. People have no idea. And what I mean by that is, you know, you didn't, yeah, I know you know this, but maybe people listening don't, so I want to share it with you. You didn't turn out the way you are today just on a fluke. You know, you had people who sat down and tried to create a plan for what we think society would be and how that manifested itself in our personal lives. We never saw it as separate. So we lived by principles and we did our best. And I'm talking about your mother, who I've been divorced from going on 30 years. We did our best from that date you were born up through while I'm talking right now to maintain those revolutionary socialist principles. And other people did too. Unfortunately, we had family. It took family, and you know this, it took them a while to come around, but they eventually did when they saw we were serious. And we had our APRP community that were trying to practice the same principles that we were. So we had that reinforcement. But you really have no idea how much hell we have had to go through to try to live as upright human beings with values that represented people over profit, that represented justice over BS. You have no idea how difficult it's been to live this life. You have no idea whatsoever, but you can have an idea. You can understand it. And the way you understand it is by understanding that the only way that we, you know, I've been in the APRP going on 37 years, and I haven't just been coasting during that time. I've been working hard for those 37 years, and I've seen people come and go. I've seen probably thousands of people come and go, not just in our organization, but other organizations. I've seen people come in so militant, you couldn't get a word in edgewise, and then 2 months later, they found Jesus and they no longer want anything to do with struggle. And I'm not throwing shade at you finding Jesus, but I am throwing shade at you finding a drug to numb you to the realities of fighting against the system for justice, and not having the character to try to learn the necessary skills to fight through that struggle so that we can get stronger. Because this belonging to an organization, as Shakur said, and this political education that's been a part of the organizational process, that's the only thing, just speaking for myself, that's the only thing that's allowed me to weather the relentless attacks that have been directed at not just me as an individual, but my lifestyles. It wasn't me as an individual. It was what I was struggling so hard to represent. That's the only way to do that. And because when you engage in that process, you understand, you create a vision for yourself. because you're a part of a collective that's doing that. And once you consolidate that and you understand, there's nothing anybody else is going to be able to say to distract you or derail you. And so a lot of times people come to me and they're like, well, I'm discouraged. And I'm like, yeah, well, what I can recommend to you is get involved in a process like this. Yeah, I've been to therapy, but nothing has done more to develop me as a human being as this organized political education process. In fact, that helped the therapy do what it was supposed to do. So we always want to encourage you to do that and to be engaged in that process of organization and political education. That, you all, is the solution. And we keep trying to find everything else we can do other than that. And that's why we continue to suffer the way we do, because there are no shortcuts. There are not going to be any shortcuts. As long as the majority of people are not involved in an ongoing organizational effort fueled by political education, then that means the majority of people are just kind of willy-nilly doing their own thing. And the problem with that is we're fighting a system that is organized and systemic in its oppression against us, and we're willy-nilly. Well, guess who's going to win that struggle every time? So we don't want to hear anything about they're too strong, we can't do this. You don't know, because we have not organized ourselves effectively to wage a consistent and united struggle to see what would happen. Until we can do that, then we don't want to hear nothing about you're just a coward. That's all. We don't want to hear nothing about we can't win. You don't know what we can do. We don't believe that there's anything that we cannot do if we come together. We believe that nothing is impossible if we come together. So on that note, we just want to tell you to come in and check out these resources that we have that have tons of information about what we're talking to you about all the time here, and hopefully can give you further impetus to say, hey, I want to, get involved with that. And if you're already in organization, it'll help you to, it strengthen your organization. So if you want to join the All African People's Revolutionary Party, if you're African, we certainly welcome you to do that. Go to www.aaprp-intl.org. You can do that, and you can check that out and find out how you can get involved with us, and we'll talk to you more about that. If you don't want to join the party, that's fine. As Shakur said, you have to join some organization or start I wish they'd stop talking about breastfeeding organization. You start that organization and have political education. You have to do something. You cannot escape responsibility for the conditions that we face in humanity right now. And my blog is Ajamu Umi's Truth Challenge, a better world.me. I just wrote an article there, the unknown relationship between Malcolm X and Cuba's socialist revolution. So you should check that out. And then I'm also one of the humble editors for the Hood Communist Collective, hoodcommunist.org, writings from revolutionary organizers from everywhere, all over the world, you all. So you definitely want to check out all of these sources of African revolutionary perspective. And all of these folks are in organizations. Nobody that I just talked about is just individual, just doing their own thing, their own thoughts. They're all committed to a process about strengthening us and moving us forward. And we want to invite you to join us next week, March 21st. We're going to be talking about African women soldiers who have fought for justice. We're not talking about people that were in the imperialist mercenary U.S. military. So if you tuning in because you want to recognize your mother or your aunt or your sister or you who was in the U.S. mercenary, anti-human, terrorist U.S. military, then that's not the event for you next week. We're talking about people who stood up against U.S. imperialism, British imperialism, French imperialism, all of those thugs and crooks. That's who we're talking about next week, because you don't know about them, because they want you to think that Kamala Harris is your hero. You don't know anything about Mbalia Kamara or Carmen Piera or even Assata Shakur. So tune in next week. And finally, put April 4th on your calendar. I mentioned earlier, just produced this 76 manifesto, a guide for defense against white supremacist, patriarchal, fascist violence. The book is selling. People are getting it. It's only $8, you all. So people are getting it. It was priced so that you could afford it and get it. And there's stuff in there to help you organize. your neighborhood. And I'm interacting with people all over the country who are doing that, and they're wanting to get organized. And these white supremacists, these police, terrorists, all these people, they don't know what's in store for them. So join us April 4th. We're going to have a virtual book release for the book that I've been talking about, and it's going to be people on the Hood Communist Collective editorial board, outstanding organizers, Comrade Ghazi from Black Hammer, Comrade Erica from Black Alliance for Peace, Mac from Black Alliance for Peace, and my comrade Sister Onya Samu from the APRP. Shakura, who you've heard here, is going to moderate it. So tell your friends. You know, African revolutionaries can't advertise no virtual book event. Like someone asked me yesterday, well, how come you can't just publish it yourself outside Amazon? So I'm like, this was not an African that asked me this, not an indigenous person, somebody else. You can guess who, what kind of person. And there is a reason for that, because I get this from, nothing against my European family, but I get this from European people all the time. I don't get it from colonized people, because colonized people we understand. But people always say, well, why can't you do something other than Amazon? Because you have these bourgeois notions in your head, and we get it. But I told them, so explain to me how that works. Like, I've had thousands of these books sold. So how am I as an individual supposed to finance the publishing of that? Because there's no Pan-African publishers out here ready to publish something like this guide against white supremacist, patriarchal, and fascist violence. That doesn't exist. I've searched for it. I've spent 3 years putting this together, and I've sent it to dozens of publishers, and I've talked to dozens of people. So you can't just tell me something that's just based on what's in your head. I've done my research. So yeah, I don't want to go through Amazon. I don't want to go to Safeway and Kroger. I don't want to go to Target. But we got to do work to bring this system down to its knees, you all. And we will use whatever tools we can that will help us do that. So yeah, I'll publish through Amazon, and we can build enough strength to bring Amazon down to its knees. That's our objective. So we hope that you can understand that. Put all this on your calendar, do all this work. It's very critical work. No one's going to do it if we don't do it. So we thank you for joining us today. Please join us next week. Please bring some friends, tell some people. Even if you don't want to come anymore, you're like, I'm so sick of him, I don't want to come ever again. Tell somebody else, because maybe they might have more vision than you. I don't know. But we thank you for coming. We appreciate you, love you. Build one unified socialist Africa until Africa's free. No African anywhere on earth will be free. Forward ever, backwards never. Smash patriarchy. Have a wonderful rest of your Sunday afternoon.